Sure. Okay, we're recording now. So yeah, I thought we could use the time to kind of go through the use cases and just list them out and hopefully break them into issues after the call, just around what specifically we're trying to tackle with this tooling before we go ahead and just start prototyping some tools. So where to start? We've had some. So one of our issues, which was issue 84, which was a SitGIMP module dependence from Mateo. So okay, so this is again creating a tool that, like SitGIMP, that would help you test the impact of the changes in your module to the things that depend on you. SitGIMP could be used for this, and in the past, I've seen people create their own custom lookups to solve this problem. But I know from the release side, we've had some challenges with SitGIMP. That is with interpreting results, etc. So does it make sense for the team to try and prototype a more lighter weight SitGIMP to solve this problem or not? Or does
how do you use SitGIMP? So like I understand the SitGIMP part where you say, okay, I'm going to run the tests from these modules using a current version of Node. How does that extend to say, okay, now I'm going to use a new version of my package, like particularly since those packages might have like a specific version or something specified in their package.json files?
Well, I have a further. One version of Node against usually a single version of a hard-coded list of packages. What would be really ideal for me is something that's basically like Greenkeeper, but in the reverse direction, where like dynamically something can figure out who are all of my dependents on NPM, and then from that list, sort them by some metrics, I don't know, popularity, download count, something like that. And then like automatically make do what Greenkeeper does and sort of like figure out some way to run that project's CI automatically. And like the trick is that with SitGIMP, the reason why it doesn't just run on every node PR is because it's resource intensive. And the reason why Greenkeeper doesn't run their own CI and why instead you have to authorize your repo and then they push a branch to your repo, which uses your CI and whatever your throttle, like Travis gives you only 5 free builds at simultaneously at a time. And GitHub Actions probably, if it doesn't have a throttle now, I'm sure we'll end up with one. So it's like Greenkeeper basically leverages that by reusing your project's existing CI. So like something, I'm kind of envisioning something where like in the ideal case, a project signs up to have it itself automatically tested when its dependencies are about to update, as opposed to after they've already published it. I don't know if that makes sense. So, like I'm thinking in terms of scalability, like I have 200 plus modules and like I can't possibly enumerate the important dependents of even a significant chunk of those, but it'd be really great to know before I publish a release, like the one irrevocable thing that will break the world, like, that's about to break people. What I currently do is I publish and then I search GitHub for issue titles that match Greenkeeper's convention that tell me if any Greenkeeper enabled dependents are broken because of my update.
Right. So I wrote up a proposal about how I'm thinking about a tool which could solve this somewhat. The parts of that tool would be valuable for me on the project that I'm involved in, in the daily job. Which means that there's some overlap there, which means that it would be easier to get time and budget for that, to work on that for me. And the tool itself, so I described an MVP a very, very, very basic thing, right? So there's several parts of the tool that to make this work, right? You need two big chunks. One is to resolve the dependence. The other one is to actually run the tests. Resolving the dependence, in a way, this is the easy part, because it could just take the SIGIM JSON format that's already there, as in you have a hard-coded list, and then have some tooling which automatically updates that list with an approval, because it's not like you're going to want to test every single library that everybody forked that. I mean, you may want to do that, knowing somebody who runs node 0.10 and doesn't do breaking changes. They may want to run that on all the packages that ever depend on there, but that would be very, very costly and very, very expensive, right? If you're like thousands of packages could be depending on something. So
like
it's all about.
has 39,000, so I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah. That's
I mean,
probably.
That's kind of why I was thinking like sorting by metrics. Like, so this is the sort of thing that I think NPM probably already has an API for dependence. And if not for dev dependence, then that's part of something we've already been asking them for. So like, I can envision a way where you say like this, like where you apply some filters and you say like, I want this number of my dependents sorted by this metrics. And then we use the NPM API to just spit out the list.
It's not necessarily even an NPM API for that, because I would find that a bit hard to get into the enterprise context with NPM Enterprise and all the other alternative registries. However, GitHub itself, it can query across a lot of things, and you can say file name package JSON, and you can query for certain strings, and you can probably use BigQuery or something like that to retrieve the actual dependence from GitHub. Non-forked ones, sort them by star. But this is, I think, resolving the dependence is one work stream in terms of automating that. But I think the very initial version, the MVP, it does not need to have automatic resolution of the dependence, right? What you need to do is you can start off with the way Node's SIGIM works, have a hard-coded JSON which says these are the dependence that I want to test with. But then comes the second part, which is running the actual tests. And in my proposal is you actually use, if you own the dependence, then you can set up the thing which would just open up the pull request and insert a Git-based dependency into package JSON, so that from your branch, while you have your pull request open and you have your branch, you can insert a Git-based dependency instead of the Semver specifier, and then it will just download and install that. There's some gotchas there if you have compiled stuff, but that all can be solved, right? And then you open up a pull request in the dependent, saying that, you know, if I were to run with this branch that's still in Git, what would the result be? The major benefit of that is that because you're opening up a pull request, you're running in exact same Travis configuration or GitHub action configuration that would that a normal master or pull request would run, right? So you're getting the exact same configuration. This is okay if you own the dependent. This is slightly less okay if you don't own a dependent, because opening up, you know, your own test pull requests in other people's repos may be a bit unethical. So for these cases, I think it should be easy enough to fork these. And yeah, so you can fork them into your test organization. So for example, if you're building something like Fastify or Express, you could have an organization which says either Fastify SIGIM or Fastify Dependence or something like that. And then it automatically forks there. It automatically keeps those forks up to date, and it opens up the pull requests there. And then the tool itself is just, needs to just report the result of each pull request back. But even if it doesn't report the pull request back as an MVP, just opening up the list of these pull requests, just opening up all these pull requests and running these things by using the Git-based dependent in the real CI that the dependent is using, I think it gives the major benefit, because you can get the result, you can inspect, and you can build further automation on top of that. So this is the MVP that I'm thinking about.
Is it
a good point on the draft pull request? Yeah.
In terms of creating those forks, are there any gotchas in terms of like the configuration for GitHub Actions or Travis or anything like that? Like, do you just fork it and the config will
Anything that requires secrets will just not work, but currently anything that requires secrets won't work on any pull request that comes from a fork anyway. So on any open source project where you expect pull requests from people who don't have write access on the repo, you already can't rely on secrets. So theoretically it should be fine for the open source use case.
Yeah, I think the secrets is probably less of an issue for regular tests, right? There will be a lot of modules that use things like source labs and all of that, but I think these are more complex cases which can be covered later. Because if your tests depend on using browser stack or that kind of thing with an API key, then this approach, then there is no simple approach, right? But usually there would then probably be a command that you can run locally for somebody who can develop that, right? And then maybe it can be worked around in some way. I think that's a bit more than the MVP though.
I guess it's really how open to will people be to, you know, having, I think the PR, if there was some way to trigger the testing in the original project without a PR, would people be worried about that? I can see the PRs might kind of clutter things up, right? If you have a bunch of PRs that are opened and then.
Yeah, so Travis does trigger builds on new branches, but if you don't have write access to the repo, then you can't push a new branch, and then you probably can't.
It's not just
I don't know
Travis,
if you can kick it off the fork.
Yeah, every CI system, including GitHub Actions, lets you trigger on branch and or pull request. It's just a question of whether they have branch builds enabled and enabled for non-master branches. But then on top of that, like you said, if you don't have write access to the repo, you can't push a branch, which is why the way Greenkeeper works is you have to give it write access to your repo so it can push a branch and get the builds that way.
And I mean, it could be built as eventually extended to be an application which does do what Greenkeeper does, right? But this is, I think, a large amount of work, which I mean, unless there's funding and budget and all of that, I don't see myself being involved because there's only so much that can be devoted here.
Right? I think it's important though to evaluate what we would want it to be, and then which subset of that we want to be the MVP. Like if what we wouldn't want to do is build an MVP that you know, prevents us from being able to get to the places we want to go in the future.
Sure, absolutely. That's why I'm thinking about a set of libraries and even start off not even as a GitHub application or anything, just a CLI, which, you know, you can compose them and split off and so that's why resolving the dependencies and running tests are two completely different things in my idea.
Yeah, I think, yeah, starting with a list with, but I think to Jordan's point, we can also say, but you know, the separate piece of work would get you to the point where it could automatically help you choose would be good. In terms of the app, I guess the app that what you were saying is that the logic that Greenkeeper has to be able to run the tests without a PR or is that you figure that's a fair amount of work to put together?
I think putting up everything that has everything is a fair amount of work, right?
Yes.
Which is, I mean, you have to get an application, you have to publish it, you have to get keys, you have to set up all the access and then use the APIs. Whereas something as simple as a CLI, and like even we could leverage the latest GitHub CLI tooling, right? You're on a branch locally. You're opening up a pull request and you run a command locally, which opens up a bunch of pull requests and then collects the results of these pull requests. That gives you, you know, the 80% of what you want.
Right, and it's just easier because if there are forks in your org, that's a lot easier to do.
Yeah, and also because you're locally, then you already have your tokens set up, your access set up, and all of that. It's all there, so you don't need any additional infrastructure. I don't know whether GitHub applications they need extra backing services that need to be running somewhere. So
in order to store the access, like we do have to have a service. So I think you're right that setting it up in such a way that we could add a service later, but we don't need a service, meaning it's a bunch of CLIs and you provide your own access keys when needed and so on. I think that's definitely the better first approach.
I mean, it could eventually, the tooling could eventually evolve into a GitHub action, because at the end of the day, a GitHub action is you can call the CLI and then it can happen automatically as you open a pull request and post a comment. But yeah, that's why I'd suggest a CLI and a library as a starting point.
Yeah, I guess I just hope that it's like the current Stitchum approach is certainly an MVP in the sense that it would do something, but like essentially all that would let me do is set up the like 5 dependents that have complained in the past when I broke them or something, and it wouldn't actually like help me. It wouldn't help me at a sufficient scale, and so what I would hope is that this stuff would allow me to, even if I had to manually run commands, allow me to generate an actual long list of things to test and provide the tooling so that I could do that without spending 3 weeks on my own CI budget. You know what I mean? Like,
yeah, absolutely. Which is why if a simple CLI is a
Are other people still there? I can't hear Dominicus anymore.
I think I lost Dominicus' audio too.
Okay. Okay.
0.5 downloads or something.
You were off for a little while there, Dominicus, but
yeah, I mean, I don't have a great connection these days for now. Yeah, so what I was saying is yeah, all of these things can be built on top of a very small thing and extended, and especially if it's modular, like even if it's even just having a separate CLI which says, get me a list of dependents which have more than X downloads as an API, whether from NPM or GitHub, that's a tool that's valuable to have on its own. Yeah. And then it's just a matter of transforming that. And then having additional CLIs which would automatically maintain your list of forks without you having to get involved, right? And then automatically having a tooling which scans the pull requests, because you can scan the pull requests that you've opened in other repositories, be it forks or not forks, based on a naming convention, right? That can solve, or based on a tag inside the comment. So I think all of these things can be built and can be composable.
Yep. Yeah, and I guess starting with the fork is much more manageable, but it's I guess like that could be in the end a configurable thing that says for this package, you use this fork. For other packages, people who have opted in, you can actually, do something against their repo itself.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so that kind of covers the how can a module author test whether their changes are going to impact the modules that depend on them. Is there any, as module authors, do you have any concerns about the health of the tree above you? Or would that tool actually solve both? So the dependent module could kind of like subscribe or opt into this thing, and then that they are protected, or they get the updates into their repo.
So I think that is awesome. A way for me to opt in to having my dependencies versions checked prior to being published against me would be amazing. But I already get that on publish from Greenkeeper and Renovate and all the equivalent services. Okay. So like but being able to do it before publish is amazing. Like I was very stoked to add resolve to Stitchum, because now it means I never have to scramble to fix resolve. Like I've been notified in advance. So that's like really valuable.
Okay.
And then there was a question in chat about test cases. Like what I like about Greenkeeper's approach is that it just automatically works with whatever my repo already does for tests, because that way I don't have to, like, because otherwise you like, not every repo is going to be as simple as npm test. Some of them are going to have a build process. Some are going to have stages and like run Babel on latest node and then use the Babel output on multiple node versions and stuff like that. So like I think it dodges a lot of problems if we can find a way to reuse the project being tested's CI.
Right. So so there's the two pieces. There's like being tested when you have an update, testing in your dependence CIs, and then there's the testing. You could think about running your dependency tests, but I think like in my mind that only the one way kind of makes sense, right? Because you don't need to run, your test coverage should cover any changes you've made in terms of using your dependency versus having to run their tests, right?
Yeah, the dependencies, they're usually tested through like nightly if you have some matches in range, or Greenkeeper can test them for you before upgrading, or renovate, whichever other approach. So I think the dependencies, they're okay to be covered. They're already mostly covered, I'd say.
Okay, I think that kind of answers, because I know Andrew was on the call, built a tool that would test the dependencies, so the health of the tree above. So it'd do an npm install and then run each of the tests that are currently, each of the modules test suites that are currently installed. It doesn't sound like that's the way we want to go forward with. It sounds like we want to do it kind of the other way. The parent module is trying to work out the impact of their changes rather than the other way. So there was a PR in Sitgem.
Well, wait, just to clarify, I'm sorry, was that request for, I want to make sure that my dependencies have passing tests on their already published versions?
Yes.
Like, okay, I mean, that, I guess it's sort of a way of saying like, judge the quality of my dependencies, but like, to me, that doesn't seem, I don't know, like I feel like you could do that by checking all the GitHub repos on your direct dependencies, and then asking GitHub's API for the branch protection status of master, or of that tag release or whatever. Like, I don't even think you have to install anything in most cases.
Right, sure, yep. Okay.
Yeah, and this PR is a bit of a separate concern, right? This is about including the dependencies in Sitgem, because if you're including a module in Sitgem to make sure against that it still works against the upcoming version of Node, then you maybe want to test the dependencies of that as well. And this is about making sure that Node doesn't break the parent module, the dependent module, as well as its dependencies.
Okay, actually, yeah. So I do like that a lot for Sitgem specifically, not as like a general ecosystem thing, but as like, it makes sure that if I have a module that Node cares enough about to pre-test, that all the things I dynamically choose to depend on, or, not dynamically, but like that over time I choose to depend on, also are tested against the Node versions I like. And that would cover things that my tests don't cover within my dependencies. Is that accurate?
That's my understanding.
Yeah.
Okay. Because my tests already will exercise them, but maybe not fully. And that's what this would do.
Yeah, I guess it's just kind of like a shortcut. So rather than you having to explicitly list out the ones that you're interested in and add them to the Sitgem lookup, you could just run this. But then again, you might want to actually explicitly add them to the lookup, because maybe some modules you care about more than others in your tree. Okay.
Yeah, I think what what Jordan might have been saying is he'd be happy if Node did that testing. Basically, we'd validate that not only
You cut out for
is
me,
the new
Michael.
version of Node not breaking, the module he created, but any of the dependencies that he's depending on.
Yeah.
But it wouldn't make so much sense for the package maintainers to run it because they're probably just running on one of the LTS versions of Node or one of the already shipped versions of Node.
Okay.
But I can see, like in the Node case, it might explode the number of modules, right?
I think it's a custom option to do like a bespoke test for something like Express or something.
Right.
Okay. So it kind of sounds to me like there's been a lot of discussions over time about whether we can leverage SitGym, but it does sound like from Dominicus's suggestion that SitGym probably isn't the best way of tackling this, and maybe creating some bespoke small modular tools to solve some of these problems, probably under PKG.js. Makes sense?
Well, and that take lessons from and likely a lot of code from SitGym, right? Like probably a good chunk of SitGym's code can be trivially adapted to Dominica's suggestion, right? Like, so it's.
Yeah, like if we
definitely. Yeah, definitely. There's some stuff, especially the format. Format alone is useful.
Right, if we have to parse that file and whatever.
Yeah.
And I think it sounds like, it could be broken down into some pretty smaller things, like, something which basically just gets the list of dependents is like something that'd be a starting point. And then you talked about the fork management, something that would basically take one of those, create or manage the fork, update the fork, run the tests is another small bit, and then something that pulls that together for a list of them. Do people know, is there an API from NPM that we can use to just say, can you give me the list of dependents?
I think there used to be, but it was kind of hidden in the CouchDB application, and that's probably gone by now. So I'm not sure if there's an easy one.
I know Darcy demoed in Montreal that they now show it kind of on the homepage, so whether that's accessible, but it does list like 40,000 for Express. But I'm assuming that data may be surfaceable via the API.
I guess the question is like, as an MVP, do the maintainers have a good enough feel of the important dependents? Or is something needed to help, get the list and figure out the number of downloads or whatever, like ones that might actually be important to test with?
I mean, I don't have anything as big as Express, I think, in terms of the depth graph, but like, I don't have a feel for that. And if you noticed that list on the package page was not sorted by a meaningful metric.
Right, now in theory, even just using through screen scraping, you could hit Express, you could get that list of dependents, and then you could hit each page for them to get the list of downloads.
Yeah.
So I'm pretty confident NPM does have an API for this, because anything they don't offer an API for, people are going to scrape their website for. So like,
right, they don't want that.
They don't show dev dependents separately on the page. They're not bundled into dependents either, which kind of sucks a lot for like, if you're an ESLint plugin, for example, almost nobody directly depends on you, but you might have 100,000 dev dependents. But that's something that there's already an open RFC for NPM to add. So I'll make sure the next RFC call to ask about it like whether dependents and thus dev dependents have an API. It doesn't seem like too difficult a thing for them to add.
So it does sound like if someone wanted to try and create a small tool today, they could try and just get that list out and surface, somehow filter the response, maybe by download counts, or potentially even allow people to configure how it's filtered. And then if that was on NPM, even just having a list of, hey, these are the modules that depend on me that get a lot of downloads, then that might be interesting as a module on its own and a good first step.
Yep.
Yeah, and with relation to Dominicus's concern earlier about enterprise stuff, like, I mean, I think there's enterprise uses not GitHub or GitHub Enterprise just as often as it uses not NPM or NPM Enterprise. And so there's going to be alternative NPM servers and alternative Git version control servers. And so like a tool that had any way to combine multiple graph sources so that I didn't have to make one list from GitHub and one from NPM and one from Artifactory and one from, and so on, would be really helpful. Like as a V2 beyond what you were describing, Beth.
Right. In your, so Dominicus, in the case of getting the packages themselves, what's used in the non-NPM case?
Sorry, not sure. How do you mean?
So a different way of saying is there any other way, like in those situations, how would you figure out what the dependents are for a module?
Right, if you don't have access to NPM public?
Yeah.
Well, if you don't have an NPM registry, whether that's NPM public or private, or if you don't have GitHub
right.
public or private, then how do you generically like get access to the dependency graph?
I guess if you haven't published it to those, it's only internal, isn't it?
Yeah, so I'm not sure. GitHub itself seems to have a notion of dependencies, right? It's parsing package JSONs, it's giving you alerts and all of that. So it has some smarts around that, but I haven't seen any API around that. It also has a graph of forks, so it definitely can do, a lot of things in there. But if you're not using either GitHub or NPM, then I'm afraid I'm not sure, because I'm using GitHub Enterprise and NPM Enterprise.
Right. So you're thinking that GitHub can give you, where do you get the dependency information? Like, do you have an example of, say, the Express repo where you can figure out who depends on Express through GitHub?
I'm not sure. But like you can. So even just using the basic search, you can say, there you go, dependency graph. But this only it also lists dependents in here as well. Yeah, dependencies and dependents.
Hey everybody, sorry I'm late. It does, okay. But it's go take a look. It is a deep dependency, so it's not direct dependence necessarily. This includes transitives.
We thought 40,000 was bad.
Yeah, that's right. Well, there's 5. Okay.
The best part is it also includes like every fork of a repo that depends on you. Yeah. So even though there might only be one copy of Projective that you care about, there might be 300 forks.
Right.
This is particularly problematic if something, if the Airbnb style guide depends on you, and then there's tens of thousands of forks of it.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. Okay, but I'm sure these can be sorted by number of stars or something, or number of forks to trace back, and maybe filtered by whether it's a fork or an original, with the exceptional cases where sometimes you have projects which got forked and moved into an organization or a new owner via a fork rather than a rename or a transfer.
But I think based on the approach of having smaller command line tools, you can imagine one which uses npm to generate dependencies and gives you some sort of prioritized list. You could imagine another separate one which uses GitHub. And if if it's going to be basically, you use that as a maintainer to choose the ones you want to include in your manually configured file for now. That doesn't preclude either, or even other ones if people think of other ways of automatically figuring out what you want to test, right?
So I'm a bit late here, so I'm sorry. My calendar got all messed up, and my phone didn't warn me of the meeting. So I'm wondering. So you're talking about how to pick dependencies that you want to test in your canary, right?
Dependence.
Sorry, yes, right. Dependence. Yep. Yes, yeah.
Yep.
And so the idea is to have a static list you configure, right?
Yep.
Okay. I'm definitely on board with that. Netflix tried internally a thing that is similar to what it sounded like you were describing with the API, like getting all dependents. And it ended up having major problems in our internal infrastructure. So I imagine that would have exponentially worse problems in, open source land, just as feedback of like some people actually tried that. One thing we've discussed doing, which we might move forward a little bit on, is out of those 100, dependents. I mean, Express is much worse, but smaller packages maybe. If you take the top 100 dependents, picking like 5 at random for any individual release, and then storing off the results over a period of time, and then seeing which ones are the most likely to fail in a particular style of release, and then make sure that those ones get added permanently. So you could start seeing this not as necessarily a machine learning thing, but in the end you could actually wrap it up in a machine learning layer and let the system pick which dependencies it thinks are most likely to break.
So that's basically sounds like fuzz testing to me. I like that a lot, with the caveat that it only works in the environment you're talking about where any failures are persisted forever. I've tried fuzz testing before on just a software level, and it's far too easy for randomly generated input to create a failure that is then lost forever to the ether, and I can never fix it.
Yeah, that's a good point. So one thing I've been thinking about how I was about doing something like this with a GitHub action, and they have the storage API now, which we could probably use here if we built this on top of GitHub Actions. And it stores, as long as you continually update the data set, right? I think it stores it for like 90 days. So as long as you're running more often than 90 days, and then obviously up until a certain size limit, that would be able to be done for free on top of GitHub storage with the Actions API. So I don't know if that will scale in the long run, but that's definitely something we could consider. That would be a free option for open source people today.
Were you saying that just trying to say run some npm queries to get the number, to get the dependencies, and then say, okay, here's the top 10 downloaded ones, didn't end up working?
No, so we tried to do a more holistic approach, like test as many as possible. Okay. That was what definitely didn't work.
Right. Okay.
What I think could work, and this is why we talked a bunch about this internally. So we have this project that didn't really get off the ground because, again, a bunch of infrastructure issues related to it, that tried to do this methodology, and people's tests were too fickle. There was too much load by trying to actually, and I say too much, obviously you can overcome it, but the cost outweighs the benefit at some point. just even cloning and running all the tests, like you have to have orchestration between all the people you're going to be running their tests, make sure that they're compatible in your infrastructure. If they need extra, like we have test suites that take 45 minutes, right? Running that in a system like this is just almost, that's a huge, huge overhead. So the way that we were talking about getting around some of that is trying to randomly pick 5, something that is within your limit of being able to test in a reasonable fashion, and then picking a random 5 every time you run the tests, so that so that you can build up like a history of those tests are fickle. We know when that particular library fails, we might want to flag it for manual review and then like not use it as an automated blocker, right? As opposed to like, oh, if those tests fail, those are like super reliable, block your release on that, right?
Right. Okay. So
right.
So I think we were thinking very simple starting point would be like, you like today, even just, you want to figure out, you look at the express list, 39,000, how would you decide, unless you already have a good idea, which are the most important ones to test? So the simplest would be like, a tool that says, get my dependents, maybe just look at the download counts and pick the top 10 or something. And then that would be information for the package maintainer to decide how to, which ones to put into their hard-coded list in terms of testing. The picking a random set every time sounds like a great way to then add to that, but wouldn't necessarily be needed to start off in the beginning.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think that works really well for something like Express. I'm just not sure how that's gonna, because we have dependents that are massively important, or right? Things that don't have clear, wow, that one we definitely need to test. And especially if the top 10 all have fickle tests of their own. That's, I think, where the approach I was thinking of would fit more cleanly, would be for smaller ecosystems. But
when you say fickle, you mean ones that just are flaky, or?
Yeah. I mean, right. We all try to have really great, reliable test suites, but not everybody achieves it. So, recognizing that as sort of just an inherent problem here.
Yeah, I guess even that part is maybe something, part of the process or solution or whatever needs to say, for the ones you're choosing to include, you need something to figure out whether they're stable enough to include or not, because that can chew up a huge amount of time.
Right. I wonder if like looking at GitHub action history or Travis test history would be enough to also add as a filter, right? So if they're always green, then you take that as a signal.
So the old GitHub CLI has hub CI status, which just reports the yellow thing, the green tick mark that you have next to each commit. I would think that if you're running a test against a dependent, then you probably need to pay attention to whether your starting point has a check mark, or whether the current CI status of the current master that you're modifying, whether it's green or not. The flaky tests, that's a bit of a more dramatic issue, because you might not know. If your starting point is green, you will not. It will be hard. You will get some sense, unless you're working with a 3-day out. You will not get a good feeling what might or might not be flaky. So this will definitely be a problem. That doesn't mean that the release needs to be blocked or not blocked. I mean, this can always be sorted out with the author of the dependent to talking to people, but also without having data to back up all of these decisions, as a maintainer of a popular library, what do you do? I think without actually trying to do this, we will not be able to discuss this, to figure this out, how to solve this problem, right? So if we build a very simple tool and it tells us that, Jordan goes and tests 100 dependents and 90 of them are failing anyways, then we have a completely different problem we need to solve in the.
And I mentioned earlier in the call that my current approach for this is GitHub issue search for Greenkeeper's message that tells me that my dependency failed them. And I subscribe to all those, and a good large percentage of them are failing unrelated to my publish. And so I usually comment on there and I'm like, hey, just heads up, this isn't my fault. And then I wait for them to close the issue, but they rarely do in those cases. So it would be really useful to be able to differentiate between things that started out red, or even just winding back until the last green point and starting from there. Because it's also possible that I broke them a year ago and then they don't really pay attention anymore, and I could still fix them. And even though they don't pay attention, the other people that don't complain, I could still fix it for them. So it would still be useful for me to just go back on all my dependents and say, from the last green point, do you stay green with all my new versions or not? And if there is no last green point with the npm installs at the latest version or whatever, then I don't care. But
yeah, that seems like that would be a pretty good workflow, would be try to do it at master, even if it's red, right? And then if it fails again, find the last green point, rerun there.
And you can even use
there, it's you. Well, you think it's you. If it succeeds there, you think it's them, right?
Right. And you can also npm supports a before parameter that you may even be able to specify by environment variable, so that you could tell them to install all of their dependencies as it was, with the versions on the last good date. So you can actually that's a potential technique as well, to isolate did a different dependency update and break them, because you can install everything as it was on the last time that CI passed, and then you can just update me or my package and then see if their tests still pass or fail.
Yeah,
and that might even be a useful
really
technique in general, because then you never have to account for other dependencies breaking you, even if their CI was good yesterday. If you and another one of their dependents published today, you can very quickly figure out which one of you broke them.
Well, you don't never need to. It might be a confluence of the two updates that break.
Oh yeah, that's true.
So
fair point.
But still, that's still a much better scenario than we're in today.
Yeah, it's pretty.
Yeah.
Yeah, kind of as an aside, we see this problem with SitGym and node testing as well. So when we do a node release, we have to figure out, did the node release actually break the module, or was the module broken anyway? Because SitGym pulls from latest. So it's possible that we've had both a module update and a node update at the same time, and then we have to dig in and go and figure out which of the two has caused the breakage. And our solution for that, I think, is just to run SitGym twice. So on the old and the new version. So kind of interesting how the problems are.
And for Node, I think that works awesome. But and actually, that's something we could do here too. That same approach. Sorry, go ahead. I cut you off.
No. You go ahead. I just wanted to add on to that after. So go ahead.
Yeah. So just saying that, what we could do is run the whatever we're going to call this, the canary build. We could run it against the latest master of a dependent, but also simultaneously run it against the last, an npm install with a before date of the last time their CI passed. And then the confluence of those two results will tell you if they both pass, you're good. If the old one passes and the new one fails, then you have to do one more run to figure out if it's you or another dependency. And if they both fail, then it's not your fault. Something like that.
I'm just thinking about you're doubling the testing.
Yeah,
you're totally doubling it. But I mean, if
possibly more than that, right? I mean, it depends.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
you said 3 runs there for sure, which is that where we're hitting that case, why the load can get really high here. But also to add to this, unfortunately, one thing we were just dealing with yesterday. Node versions here do matter, right? So like, for example, the gRPC library, pretty popular, has a bunch of versions that are not compatible with Node 12 in their current version line, right? Their current major line. So the newer ones are compatible. So if you ran your tests against that, newer version and it failed, and then you went back to the previous success and it happened to be one that previously didn't work with Node 12, and now you're testing in Node 12, you're going to get a failure where it's actually because of Node 12, not because of your module, right? Does that all make sense?
Yep.
Yeah, it's just realized how much of a matrix this problem's going to be, because it's possible that a module supports like 3 distinct release lines, and you have...
Well, and this also suggests like why it would be more beneficial to run a service as opposed to having this be just CLI tools, because such a service could, for any dependency that's about to be run, it could like rerun without any, like it could basically determine if a given dependent is in a passing state or not. And then that result can be shared across all of the things that it depends on.
Yeah. As long as it was a federated system and not some central service, I agree with that, right?
Sure.
But like, I would like to be able to run from a CLI and say, hey, run this thing, but use whatever cached results you find on the net, right? Like on the service. Mm-hmm. And then it only runs the new stuff that hasn't been rerun before. So if there was like a, previous state that was already run. Well, see, but would there be? Because you're testing a new version of your package.
Right.
There's not going to be any shared.
Well, right, but what you want to know is with the latest version, like if you just cloned that dependent and ran npm install, would its CI pass, and on which node versions? Like you need to know that as a base in order to know the delta and then whether it's your fault.
Right.
But I'd be tempted to try and start by limiting the variations and change in the dependence as a first step, like maybe to the latest published version of your dependence, because in theory, when they publish a new version of their module, they ought to be doing some testing against the versions they're going to allow in, and if you've published a new one, they would catch it. Like, you might not catch it quite as soon, but they would catch it. But in terms of trying to like reduce the explosion of combinations,
so in theory, though,
they shipped.
In theory, though, that's the most reliably passing one, right? Like in most cases, wouldn't that be the most reliable passing state? Would be the newer, like the newest release?
Well, in terms of not having changed, with ignoring the changes in your package, yes.
Right. Okay, that's what I was. Right. So, but we've got a lot of threads going on here. So one of the threads was we have a baseline, which is their existing tests running without your change. Right. In theory, that's the most reliably working one with your existing version. With your new version, right? So what would be a more likely to break scenario would be your new version with an older version of one of their packages that's still within your the Semver range, right? That the consumers might have, right? Like,
that's basically the peer debt problem, but like, it still applies to dependencies in subtle ways.
Okay.
I guess it's like what happens, which problems are, like, can we figure out which is the most common and just try and target that one combination to start? Because otherwise, I think we're just there'll be too many, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm kind of conscious of time because we've only got like half a minute left. So I will try and rewrite our notes in a more readable format under each of the kind of use cases we've spoken about. I think it's still worth probably spinning off an issue in package maintenance to create a small module that gets the list of dependencies and maybe filters them. Maybe even just to prototype it and see whether the list that comes back actually works for some of our modules. So whether when we run it with Express, the top 10 modules actually seem and look like the biggest 10 modules that depend on Express.
Yep.
Yeah.
I'll try and raise a couple of issues. Maybe we can reflect again in the next package maintenance call, or we could try and set up a more regular time for these tooling discussions.
I'm
Thinking
fine
like
doing
maybe-
another meeting if that works, but I think this sounds like somebody should just go off and write that, and then we can come back. Like, do we need another meeting to do the next steps there?
I don't think so, no, and we can always add it to the agenda for discussion in the regular package maintenance meeting, and when we need them, spin up these kind of breakout ones.
Sounds good.
Okay, sure. I'll hopefully get these typed up and PR'd in. But thanks for joining, everyone. Really useful. And yeah, speak to you all later.
Thanks.
Thanks for organizing, Beth.
Bye.
I was late.
And taking notes. Appreciate it.
All right.